us about your career.
So I did go to Notre Dame. I was fortunate to develop mentors at Notre Dame. One of them was the dean of the law school, and he was instrumental, Dave Link, in getting me my first job. My first job as a law clerk on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. I clerked for Judge Robert Sprecher. And that was a wonderful position to have because it opened the door to so many opportunities. I then left Judge Sprecher and went to the U.S. Attorney's Office because I remembered Perry Mason and I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And the prosecutor's office was a great place to feel like I was doing justice and to also get the skills that I wanted to be a trial lawyer. So I started out in criminal receiving and appellate in that division, moved to the main criminal division, ultimately became deputy chief of a division and ultimately chief of a criminal division. So that was a great experience for me. And there were challenges that I faced there because when I was initially hired, it wasn't in the specific criminal division I wanted to be in. I wanted to be in criminal receiving and appeals. I had been an appellate law clerk. But the division I was put in was public protection and civil rights. I was fortunate to have a great supervisor, Alana Rovner, who became a lifelong friend, who became a district judge before I did and also was the first woman on the Court of Appeals in the 7th Circuit. But I felt I should have been in that other division. And in my division were all women and one black man.
Interesting.
So I tried to transfer to the division I thought I should be in, and I was told by the chief of the division, no, there were no openings. And so eventually I met a deputy chief in that division and became friends with him and volunteered to do appeals for him and got my whole little group to do that. And then I got him to go to ask the chief of the division to help us get more opportunities so that we could work with the agents. And he did. And that then led to me moving into the correct division. And then one other story in the U.S. Attorney's Office. After I'd been there a while, a lot of women were there. We realized that we weren't on all the sexy cases, the high-profile corruption cases. And I actually decided, because I had taken a trial ad course from NITA, the National Institute for Trial Advocacy, that I would go to the state's attorney's office because I'd met a lot of state's attorneys and they told me in a year or two I could make first chair. But I developed a lot of mentors among the judges, and I went to this one judge, Nick Bua, who I tried 5 cases before. He had been a state court judge, and I said, Judge Bua, I just wanted you to know I'm going to move to the state's attorney's office if I get an offer. And he said, well, Ann, you really, I think you belong here in the federal courts. He said, have you talked to your supervisor? I said, no. He said, why not? I said, it should be obvious. No women have been on these high-profile political cases. He said, well, before you make that kind of move, talk to your supervisor. And so I did. And the supervisor said, the chief of the division said, you know what, I really hadn't thought about that. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from the chief of the division, and he said, I have a case I want you to try with me. And it was a complex political corruption case. We were on trial for 2 weeks. I was scared, but I knew that if I rose to the challenge, that might change my career path. And it did. And it did. So there are 2 lessons from that. Number 1, you have to stand up for yourself. And that's what Nick Bua really taught me, that lesson. And how can you expect to get change if you don't ask for change? And so that's what I did, and that ultimately got me where I needed to go. And then finally, when I was on maternity leave, I was deputy chief of a division, and I had heard a rumor that day that the chief of my division was leaving, and he was taking a different position, and so I felt that I was one that should get the position. But I also heard in that rumor I was not the one that was getting the position. So, learning from the lessons of Judge Nick Bua, I called the U.S. attorney and got an appointment to meet with him, and I met with him. And he congratulated me on having the baby and everything. And then he said, well, what can I do for you? And I said, well, I've heard this rumor, and I've heard that I'm not the one getting the position. And he said, that's true. And I said, well, I want to understand why. I said, you know, I've done a huge amount of work in that division. I've worked with the young lawyers. I prepare them for trial. I help them edit their briefs. And I don't understand why they get the position. So he said, well, it boils down to my personal preference. And I said, well, I was very upset. He said, but there's another position, Chief of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force. There'll only be 12 chiefs around the country. You'll get to work with Maine Justice. So I went home, I was still upset, but then I realized I would be a chief, I could work with Maine Justice, and I would get a raise. And so I took that position, even though I didn't want to. And that's the other lesson. Sometimes what happens is you have to say yes when you want to say no. Because you never know what's behind the door. So it turned out that was the best move I made, because I mentioned that I would, I had to be approved in Maine Justice, and so the chief of the criminal division interviewed me. That was Rudy Giuliani. Ultimately, I worked for Lowell Jensen in the Justice Department. And so when my name came up for the judgeship, who do you think stood up for me? People in the Justice Department. I had worked with 5 U.S. attorneys. Each of those U.S. attorneys in Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Chicago, and there was one other state, Minnesota. Each of them stood up for me. That made a difference because I was not political. You remember I said I started as a law clerk, so I've never been able to get involved in politics. So I was considered an independent, and I considered myself an independent. But if I had not had that exposure to Maine Justice and to all those U.S. attorneys, in my opinion, it would have been very difficult for me to go on the bench. So you do have to say yes sometimes when you want to say no, and you have to stand up for yourself and let your voice be heard. And there's a way to do it. Like, I wasn't confrontive when I went to the U.S. attorney, but I was direct and matter of fact. I've always used humor in the way I deal with people, but he got my point. And so that's standing up for yourself, because the bottom line is, if you don't stand up for yourself, who will? The question is, how do you stand up for yourself, and when do you stand up for yourself? The second thing is, when a door closes, another one opens. So when I didn't get chief of that division, I was devastated, but look at the door it opened. And I believe generally in life that when doors close, you have to find a way around the door. You have to find a way to open the door, or maybe that door isn't for you, and you move to the next door. But you can't give up.